I ruined my ex-boyfriend's life 20 plus years ago, and I just made sure it stayed ruined by. When I was in college in the 90s, I met Jake, then M23, through mutual friends. He had already graduated and was planning to move to the opposite side of the United States for grad school, while I had already been making plans to move with friends only a 90-minute drive away from where he was moving to. We had so much in common, fell in love, and it really seemed like fate, both planning to move 3,000 miles and landing so close together. He had two sisters and a younger brother who were all awesome people, and I became instant friends with them as well. Because he was in school and I was working, I would usually go to him to hang out on weekends. He was renting a house with two roommates, also in his program. We were young, so money was tight, but we had fun, went for taco dates, and spent a lot of time at his house, where he was breeding and selling small animals. Jake was an animal sciences PhD student, so being around animals was normal and I loved it. I met and became friends with his advisor's wife, Mary, F. mid-50s, who worked in administration at the university. She was a lovely woman, and I would often have lunch with her when I visited on weekends. Jake was a teaching assistant, TA, and I met other people in the program and made friends with them faster than he did. After about 2 years of dating, I was at the house one day, lying in bed together in a state of some undress, and he said out of the blue that he was concerned I'd been gaining weight and it made it harder for him to be attracted to me. There was no concern about my health. It was all about him finding me unattractive. I sat up and said, "Well, then maybe you should make sure there is better food for me to eat than crackers and cheese when I come up on weekends." Even at 23, I didn't take that kind of BS. I had gained maybe 10 pounds since meeting him 2 years earlier, and still wore the same size clothes, about a US size 6'8". I wasn't going to engage in a fight about it after all. It was his problem, not mine. So I asked him calmly, "So what is your solution to this?" He stared at me blankly and said, "Well, I guess that you should try to lose weight." And I said, "Nah, I'm not going to do that, so what are you going to do about it?" He said, "Well, I guess nothing. I wanted to let you know how I feel." I said, "Cool, thank you." Put my clothes back on, went to sleep, and drove home the next day as usual. We kept dating, and about 3 months later, he called me and said he wanted to break up after close to 3 years. The reason, and I quote, was, "You don't know enough about science." He felt like he couldn't have a conversation with me about his work without having to use common names for animals instead of scientific ones. I said, "Well, that's bullshit. What's the real reason?" He said it was the real reason. He came to see me a month later to return something of mine, and I confronted him, demanding the real reason. He finally admitted he had been seeing one of his undergrad students, let's call her Meg, a 19-year-old. He was then 26 and her teacher. I screamed at him to leave, and my roommate threatened to throw him off our second-floor balcony if he didn't go, and he left. It hit me all at once after he walked out, and I went from rage to stunned laughter. I'd met Meg a few times, and at one point she was at his house for a BBQ and spilled something all over her pants. Jake asked me if I could loan her some sweats. I couldn't because I was a size 8 and she was a size 18. Nothing wrong with that at all. But the point is, I realized he made those comments about my weight to try and get me to break up with him because he was a coward. He clearly liked a big gal. Although when he'd said those things to me about my weight, it was 1 a.m., I lived about 95 miles away, and we had just had sex, so I don't know how he thought this would go. Even in hindsight, it perplexes me. Did he think I was going to break up with him and storm off into the night and drive for an hour and a half? Anyway, I emailed his roommates. It was the early 2000s, and it's how you communicated anything you didn't want to say on the phone. I wanted to let them know we'd broken up and that they were always lovely to me and thank them for being friends. They both admitted they knew about Meg and were the ones to demand that Jake tell me, or they would. That's when he broke up with me with the lame, "You don't understand science" excuse. One of his roommates, a super nice, super cute guy named George, offered to help me get a few things still at their house that he had collected for me from around the house. He suggested I come up for the weekend, we go out and drink, and have a good time. All the things Jake didn't want to waste money on. And I said sure. So I went up, and George let me into the house while Jake was gone. I took photos of all of his animals because, while I might not be a PhD student, I paid attention and knew he had an endangered species in his care. He wasn't breeding it. It was an unreleasable animal he had taken in from a rescue organization. There was paperwork he had to submit with a $25 fee, and he refused to do it, saying he didn't want the government in his business. I took photos of that animal, all his breeding conditions, and a photo of an animal not allowed in the state, which was in a tank right next to a window and visible from outside. I then went out for a night on the town with George. We stumbled in early, around midnight, so Jake and Meg, who were watching TV, would see me in a short dress, drunk, and George practically carrying me. I spent the night in George's room. He was a total gentleman but made sure to leave the room and parade past them in his boxers a few times, and we giggled and moaned loudly so they could hear us. When I went to leave the next morning, Jake said I didn't have to act like a whore in front of him as I ate a donut slowly in my rumpled dress with messy hair, while George beamed at me and then planted a kiss on my head. Meg looked ashamed, not quite knowing where to look, and I said, "Have fun with my leftovers," and walked out. I wanted to think the petty, loud hookup and a few juvenile insults were my revenge. They were not. The next day I had my photos developed, the good old days, and called the State Office of Fish and Wildlife. I reported the animals in the house, the potential overcrowding of breeding animals, and the 2 animals he shouldn't legally have in the state, and asked them how to make a report. Turns out Jake wasn't well liked by his peers in his program or by his roommates, but I was. George had suggested that he and their other roommate could submit complaints to the university that a TA was sleeping with one of his students and showing her favoritism. The night we were out at the bars, we made sure to tell the story to anyone who they knew. They made sure all the women in his classes knew he was sleeping with Meg. It wasn't a large program, so people knew fast that he had cheated and was now dating his student. George and the other roommate made sure people knew they had put in complaints, sick of Jake's entitled BS. With my full statement made and photos sent to the state wildlife officials, I called my friend Mary, Jake's advisor's wife. She knew about the breakup and lame reason, and I let her know he admitted he was sleeping with a student. I'd been emailing with him, and he admitted to it in writing, so I sent that to Mary. To say she was not happy about that was an understatement. She made sure it would be investigated and told her husband, Jake's direct advisor, while I was on the phone with her. Speaking of investigations, a few weeks later, George called me, giddy, to say state fish and wildlife officials were there confiscating animals. He told them he would be happy to tell them whatever they needed to know. Meg was there when it happened, and told the officials that, as far as she knew, all the animals belonged to her boyfriend, Jake, and that they were all legal. That put George and the other roommate in the clear. One animal was kept in the backyard, so it was implied to Jake that a neighbor reported it. While they were there to investigate, they knew to look in the back window to see the far more problematic, illegal to have in the state under nearly any circumstances animal. Since George was on the lease, he was able to let them in to investigate in the house. The animals were all in communal areas, and the officers stayed there for a few hours and returned with a warrant to take all the animals and enter Jake's room to investigate. George and the other roommate let them into their rooms with no issues and were quickly cleared. Meg apparently couldn't get a hold of Jake while this was happening and panicked. Meg then failed the class she had with Jake, and he ended up losing his TA job and scholarship in the investigation. The cheating, along with the illegal animals he brought in, and the complaints about his general behavior from other students led to his expulsion from the program and the university. I wasn't satisfied with my minimal involvement. Oh no. I used my close ties with many in the department to try to help him find a new place in other programs. It didn't work. Between the complaints, the animals, and the inappropriate relationship, no one would take him. I have no idea what he ended up doing. I didn't speak to him again after seeing him in his home in my rumpled dress eating donuts with George in his boxers. He didn't finish his PhD, which I know, because I remained friends with George and his advisor's wife, Mary. It was the perfect revenge. It's been nearly 20 years since all of this happened, and I'm still thrilled about the entire chain of events. Meg was mortified by the way I was treated, as George kept me in the loop about the final fallout. She knew what was happening and helped in any way she could to be rid of Jake. My stepdad cheated on my mom, so we got revenge by. I moved in with my mom after her 25-year marriage to my biological dad ended. He was manipulative, but that's another story. Shortly after the divorce, my mom introduced me to her boyfriend at the time, Chris. My mom worked as a corrections officer at the county jail, and her boyfriend was a former inmate in for a DUI. That should have been the first red flag, but my mom was grieving a long marriage, and I didn't want to push the subject. Chris seemed to make her happy, and that was enough for me. My brother, sister, and I all moved in with Mom and Chris, and we seemed to get along okay. Chris and I bonded over our love of video games, and everything seemed well. That is, until 2017. Due to Chris's prior DUI, he had to go in regularly for probationary checkups at the courthouse. One day he didn't return, and we got a little worried. We then received a phone call from him, from Texas. It turns out that when he arrived at the courthouse that day, he was jumped by the FBI. His family from Texas was implicated in a number of gang and drug-related crimes, and due to a situation where he was in a vehicle during a drug handoff, he was on the hook as well. He ended up agreeing to testify against his family members in exchange for a shorter sentence and was allowed to be out of prison before the trial. My mom was distraught, and over the course of many phone calls over a year, they worked out their marriage plans for when he returned. His store owner at the DQ he worked at allowed him to come back as well, returning to his store manager position. Soon after, the drinking started. Because of his DUI, Chris was clearly no stranger to drinking. He began to drink more and more to the point where he was consuming half a 24-pack of beer a day. Chris was a mean drunk. He regularly started fights when intoxicated, and while they never got physical, he wasn't exactly kind with his words. My mom enabled his behavior for several years, saying the stress from work and the upcoming trial was getting to him. Finally, after several years, my mom had enough. Chris came home extremely drunk one night, and my mom confronted him. She asked if he'd been drinking, and when he didn't deny it, she kicked him out. He went to live with a friend temporarily. The next morning, Mom asked us to help gather a few of his essentials so that he didn't have to re-enter the home until he was sober. While we were gathering his things, we heard a knock at the front door. We opened it to find Betty, one of Chris's co-workers and someone I went to high school with. She told my mom she had something important to share. After sitting my mom down and telling her not to share where she got the info from, Betty told my mom that Chris was cheating on her with Darla. She explained how he regularly had Darla perform sexual acts in and around his workplace, how Betty had caught them, and how Chris told her that if she ever told my mom, he'd fire her. He was the store manager. And finally, she revealed that Darla was pregnant. My mom was angry. After the initial shock wore off, she told us to round up all of Chris's things and dump them outside. We took everything of his out of the house and tossed it all in the alley behind our house. Chris had no reason or ability to return to the house. It was rented with only my mom on the paperwork, so no issues there. In the meantime, she called and confronted him. He confessed to the entire affair and said he was happy Darla was pregnant because that meant he'd finally have a child of his own. Mom refused to have more kids. We three were massive strains on her body, and she likely wouldn't survive anymore. He refused to apologize for any of his actions. My mom arranged for him to collect his items from the alley, with an officer present, and he left our lives. The revenge. Now, my mom clearly wanted to dust her hands of him and move on. She was already quite emotional from the whole ordeal and wanted nothing more from him. But my sister, brother, and I had other ideas. First, we called his workplace. DQ operates as an independently owned franchise, and the owner of this branch owned several branches in the area. He was also a good friend. We informed him of the sexual acts being performed on the premises, and he went through the process of getting Chris booted from his position and barred from any of the branches in the area. Funnily, Betty got his position after he left and now runs a tight and clean ship. Chris no longer had a job or a place to live, so he went to live with Darla in a town about an hour away. We found out that he started working at another DQ in that town and informed the owner of that location of the situation. It took significantly longer due to there being no current indecent actions occurring there, but eventually he lost that job too. Soon after, Chris began driving around our neighborhood, seemingly stalking my mom and our family, probably because of his job loss. Now, due to the whole situation in Texas, he never had his probation lifted for his DUI and thus still did not have a license. He never had to drive when he lived with us since work was local and we could drive him as needed. But here he was, clearly driving around by himself when he shouldn't be. We contacted the police and informed them about Darla's vehicle in our neighborhood and that we believed Chris was driving it without a license. We told them to pull over the vehicle next time they saw it, as it would likely be Chris driving again. Sure enough, a few weeks later we were told that Chris indeed was pulled over and sent back to the local jail for driving without a license and while intoxicated. The police also did a search of the home he was staying at and found several guns on the premises. Since he was a felon, he was not legally allowed to have weapons on the premises, meaning there was more jail time tacked on. By the time his jail time had finished, it was just in time for him to be sent back to incarceration in Texas for the trial. Chris's son was born while Chris was in prison. Darla evidently realized what an absolute jerk Chris was and cut ties with him while he was in prison. During his prison time, Chris started sending tons of letters to my mom, stating how sorry he was, pleading with her to take him back, and ranting about how it wasn't his fault, all in the same letter, mind you. Mom burned every one of them. We moved on, moving out of state. Chris evidently got out of prison some years ago and now lives in Kansas, struggling and fighting child support, which Darla sued him for. Mom now has a new boyfriend who treats her right and cares a lot more than Chris ever did. My brother and sister moved on and out, and I still live with Mom, assisting her with the newly purchased home that we've been renovating. Life's looking okay.